The discography of the Beatles is so vast and filled with amazing albums, and everyone loves it so much that it's really hard to believe there's underrated albums in it. It's even harder to believe that the most underrated album by the band would be one with no major changes to their sound, one that even for the Beatles themselves was nothing more than just a contractual obligation. An album that stands just behind the band's experimental beginnings in 1965, 1964's Beatles for Sale. I think all of us here know about the reputation of Beatles for Sale, an album that was basically an early example of a cash grab because the label wanted more money, they wanted to sell more copies, they wanted to capitalize on the success of the first two albums. But personally, I think that's a huge fucking misconception of what this album actually represents. I mean, Beatles for Sale, in my own personal opinion, and I can already see the comments, was way more important for the band's evolution as songwriters than an album like A Hard Day's Night, Please Please Me, and With the Beatles. Before we get into it though, I would like to get something out of the way. If you're one of these people that say that just because they look tired, they look like they don't want to be there in the album cover, that's enough to say that they didn't want to make the album, that's probably one of the most idiotic things I've heard in my entire life, and I'm not exaggerating. Like, when you look at a Beatles album cover, do they ever look happy? You know, if you take Please Please Me out of the way, do they ever look like they actually want to be there? I mean, take a look at Rubber Soul, take a look at Sgt. Pepper, take a look at, I don't know, With the Beatles. Like, they always look like they're about to die, like they're staring at death in the face. So why exactly is it that with this album, people use the album cover as an argument to say that they didn't want to make the album? Come on now. If anything, when you look at the recording process, when you listen to the takes, it seems like they were having a lot of fun.
They said it was you. I saw you be through your way.
Alright, so Beatles for Sale. What makes this album such an important milestone in the band's discography, in my opinion, even though a lot of people seem to disagree? To understand my point, we have to go back to the very beginning of the band's discography a year before, Please Please Me and With the Beatles. These two albums were amazing, they were very unique at the time, adding a more melodic spin to rock and roll music, already done before by people like Buddy Holly and Elvis Presley, for example, but the Beatles capitalized on it and made a sound that sounded really fresh and innovative at the time. It wasn't the experimentation they played around with in the mid to late 60s, but it was definitely something new, which made them very popular in the UK. Please Please Me and With the Beatles are two of the most recognizable pieces of music in the rock and roll era of the UK. Even when bands like the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Kinks started to appear, the Beatles were still the most popular ones, and it was partly thanks to these albums. But even though both albums were unique, they were unique for the same reasons. There isn't that much evolution from Please Please Me to With the Beatles, and that changed a little bit with A Hard Day's Night. First of all, you have compositions like If I Fell and I Love Her, way more romantic, way more laid back, the tempo isn't so fast anymore. And then of course you have the fact that all of the tracks have like a uniform quality, no track is better than the other. Of course you have highlights, but most of them stay in the same realm of quality, which gives a very early example of the concept album, not in terms of narrative, but in terms of quality, like you saw in albums like Songs for the Swing Lovers and In the Wee Small Hours, and multiple jazz albums by people like Miles Davis. This is where a lot of people seem to grab their excuses to defend the fact that Beatles for Sale isn't such an important album, because they say A Hard Day's Night had an all-original track list, and now in Beatles for Sale we have covers, quite a lot, even more than the ones we had in Please Please Me and With the Beatles, so definitely there wasn't that much commitment in that album. Which is technically true. I personally believe that a cover in a Beatles album is always going to be a waste. At the time, in 1964, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the best songwriters in the world, so I don't really want to hear them singing anyone else's songs personally. And in this album, out of the 14 tracks available, only 8 of them are original compositions, either by Lennon or McCartney. But that's the thing. In these 8 compositions, you have a lot of growth, and I'm not exaggerating. There is quite a lot to see in every single one of them, especially when it comes to John Lennon. Paul McCartney also has some interesting compositions in this album, a little more mature take on romanticism in songs like What You're Doing and Every Little Thing. And then you also have I'll Follow the Sun, my personal favorite in this entire album, a clear prelude of the man's sophisticated and elegant songwriting in future albums like Yesterday in the album Help, Michelle in the Rubber Soul album, For No One in the Revolver album, and She's Leaving Home in the Sgt. Pepper album. And it wasn't only a prelude, it's also the fact that it was different. The instrumentation was way simpler, more tilting towards the folk side of things, which was obviously really important when you look at what happened in the Rubber Soul album. And these moments of change and experimentation and trying a different sound, if you know anything about music, you know that they're really important. For example, when you go to David Bowie and you saw the man going from Hunky Dory to The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust to the Berling trilogy, in every single album you're going to see a slight prelude, a slight attempt to go for the next sound. The same thing with people like, for example, the most recent Super Bowl halftime show performer Kendrick Lamar, going from Section 80 to Pimp a Butterfly in 5 years. You can see jazz elements and, narrative lyricism and voice inflections in the previous albums that resulted in the masterpiece that To Pimp a Butterfly is. These slight changes are crucial in the process of building the artist's identity, and I believe that Paul McCartney had quite a few on them in this album. However, the protagonist of this video is not Paul McCartney, so Paul, step aside.
What? How dare you ask me that?
We're talking about John Lennon now because the growth this man went through in this album alone is insane, and a lot of it is thanks to Bob Dylan. If you follow the story of the Beatles, then you probably know that we had multiple different versions of John Lennon inside of the band. So you had the Beatlemania John Lennon delivering hits like I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, A Hard Day's Night, and then you had the mid to late 60s John Lennon with songs like I Want You She's So Heavy, Your Blues, and all those weird songs that basically gave him the identity that he carried on throughout the 70s. However, we have an in-between version of John Lennon too, the one from 1964-ish, 1965 to 1967, which is my personal favorite, the man that gave us Strawberry Fields Forever, A Day in the Life, All You Need Is Love, Help, Tomorrow Never Knows, I'm Only Sleeping, and I believe that version of John Lennon was born in this album. It is well known that the Beatles were really big fans of Bob Dylan around this time, and how can you blame him? I mean, he was releasing some of the greatest folk albums ever made around this time, The Freewheeling of Bob Dylan, The Times Are A-Changing, another side of Bob Dylan with songs like It Ain't Me Babe, influencing John Lennon greatly, because in this album he's trying to replicate him again and again and again in songs like No Reply, I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black. The thing about Bob Dylan that everyone loved wasn't only the lyricism and the beautiful melodies that he came up with, the relevant lyricism of his songs, but also the fact that his performances felt so honest. When you listen to a Bob Dylan album, even in the studio recordings, you can tell that he's not able to perform the song quite well, which only adds to his genius, coming up with a melody he can't sing, but at the same time, it gives the song this layer of humanity to it, like it's not a robot singing the song, and John Lennon was a really big fan of this. At the time, even though a lot of people don't like to admit it, music was getting kind of plastic. Harmonies were masquerading the true essence of performance, and Bob Dylan was like a breath of fresh air at the time. Now, I'm not saying that John Lennon was a part of that. Ever since his performance of Twist and Shout and Anna Go to Him in the Please Please Me album and multiple live performances, you can already tell that the man was ready to challenge the status quo when it comes to performance, but in this album he capitalized on it, as you can see in his performance of Mr. Moonlight, for example. In my opinion, this album saw the birth of John Lennon as a songwriter who didn't really care if his music was for the masses or for a specific group of people. He performed and he wrote the songs about how he truly felt. I don't have to explain to you why a song like I'm a Loser, with lyrics that are not necessarily the most positive or friendly, don't really or didn't really appeal to the young crowd that the Beatles had as followers back then in the 60s. So given all the growth and all the new things we saw in this album, a new style of songwriting, a different sound palette, different instrumentation, more participation by George Harrison in this one too, how can people just dismiss this album as a cash grab by the label simply because of how they looked in the album cover? And I know that Paul McCartney and John Lennon themselves have said multiple times that this was the band basically trying to do their live act in an album, but that's not true at all. When you look at some of their sets from their 1964 and 1965 tours, there's only a couple of songs from this album, maybe more than a couple, but this is definitely not a good representation of their live set. And this happens really often in the Beatles fandom. They give you a quote of one of the band members saying something and they take that as a fact when it's known that they change their minds every 5 years or so. Look at a Paul McCartney interview or a John Lennon interview from 1970 and then look at one from 1975. They're going to be saying completely different things, which is normal. People change their minds. I'm not complaining, but I'm just saying just because they said something, that doesn't make it a fact. And I think I forgot to say this, but a lot of people seem to believe that Rubber Soul and Revolver were the first time the Beatles used the studio as an instrument. instrument, and that's not true at all. In Beatles for Sale, in the song No Reply, they use different placements and recording techniques to add the echo and the space to John Lennon's voice in that song, which sounds incredible and is the actual first recorded time that the Beatles kind of played around the studio to reach a certain effect. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that Beatles for Sale might just be, alongside Magical Mystery Tour of course, the most underrated album by the Beatles. I don't understand why so many people have so many negative things to say about this album simply because of the album cover, literally. Like, you can see a lot of comments of people going, oh, look at how tired they look in the album cover, look at how worn out they seem to be. Some other arguments talk about the covers included on that album, as if you don't have a handful of incredible songs written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney in there too. I simply don't really agree with most of the arguments people make against this album. For me, it might just be the best Beatlemania era album by the Beatles, alongside A Hard Day's Night, but I definitely think this album is way more enjoyable and way more important and significant, and most importantly interesting, than an album like Please Please Me with the Beatles, and even Help, to be fully honest with you. Because yeah, I mean, Help has the title track, Ticket to Ride, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, Yesterday, clear milestones in the band's discography, but for me, Beatles for Sale is like the perfect balance between the mid-60s, late 60s Beatles and the Beatlemania Beatles. You know, I just simply love how enjoyable and easy to listen to this album is, but at the same time represents a lot of growth and evolution for the band, especially when it comes to John Lennon. For that reason, I do believe that once again, and for completely different reasons, alongside Magical Mystery Tour, Beatles for Sale might just be the most underrated Beatles album out there.
They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
True.
But of course, that is only my own personal opinion. Part of the reason, as a matter of fact, the main reason why I make these videos in the first place is because I want to know your opinion, so go ahead and leave it down below. Do you think The Beatles for Sale is underrated, or do you think it's not an important album for the band? I really do hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making the video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.